Welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for your support. If you like documentaries, detective films, and true stories like this, please subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment. It may seem like a small thing, but it helps YouTube recommend these videos to more people and helps the channel grow. Thank you. Now, let's talk about Lars Mittank. March 15th, 2023. A woman is rushed to a hospital in Aurora, Colorado. She is weak, dizzy, and struggling to remain alert. Her name is Angela Craig. She is 43 years old. She is a mother of 6, and this is not her first visit to the hospital. It is her third in little more than a week. Doctors have been trying to understand why a previously active woman keeps becoming dangerously ill. The symptoms appear. They ease. Then they return. Each examination seems to produce another question. And standing close to her is the person the medical staff should be able to trust most, her husband. A healthcare professional, a dentist, James Craig. While doctors search for a natural explanation, someone from James's own professional circle learns about a suspicious chemical delivery and begins to wonder whether Angela is suffering from an illness at all, because the real cause of her condition may be standing much closer than anyone realizes. This is the case of the dentist who poisoned his wife. Her name was Angela Craig. She had been married to James Craig for more than 2 decades. Together, they had built what appeared to be a stable suburban life. A home, 6 children, a family dental practice. James operated a dental office in Aurora. Angela also helped with the family practice. To patients, friends, and acquaintances, he did not appear to be an obvious suspect. He was a healthcare professional, a husband, a father, the man who drove Angela to the hospital when she became critically ill. But this case would ultimately illustrate a lesson investigators encounter time and again. A person's public image is not evidence of what happens behind closed doors. And sometimes, the person who appears to be helping investigators may also be the person with the greatest opportunity to shape the story. That possibility would soon become central to this investigation. The medical crisis began in early March 2023. Angela started experiencing symptoms that doctors struggled to explain. Dizziness, weakness, headaches, nausea, and a growing sense that something was seriously wrong. No single diagnosis seemed to explain everything. According to the prosecution's later reconstruction, James had recently begun preparing protein shakes for Angela. That detail would later become one of the most closely examined parts of the case. At the time, it appeared completely ordinary. A husband making a drink for his wife. A familiar act of care. Nothing that doctors would immediately recognize as a potential clue. And that is one reason the investigation proved so difficult in its earliest stages. Sometimes, the most important evidence does not look suspicious until investigators understand the full story. Angela was first admitted to the hospital on March 6, 2023. Her condition improved enough for her to be discharged, but the improvement did not last. She returned on March 9th with many of the same symptoms. Once again, doctors treated what they could observe, and once again, no single diagnosis explained everything. Then, on March 15th, her condition became far more serious. That pattern would later become an important part of the investigation. One unexplained illness can be a difficult medical mystery, but repeated episodes, separated by periods of improvement, can sometimes suggest that investigators should consider factors beyond a single disease. A medication, a supplement, an environmental exposure, or the possibility that another person may be involved. I think that cases of poisoning are especially difficult to recognize because their early stages often resemble common illnesses. Symptoms can be vague, They can affect several body systems simultaneously, and if doctors don't know what they're looking for, routine medical tests may not immediately reveal the cause. This can create a dangerous delay. Doctors start with the explanations that are statistically most likely: infection, neurological disorder, medication reaction. This is not an error. This is how responsible, evidence-based medicine should work. In criminal investigations, if the true cause of the patient's condition lies elsewhere, this routine diagnostic process can delay the discovery of what's really going on. Sometimes, the biggest problem isn't treating the disease, but realizing that the disease may have no natural cause at all. While Angela's condition continued to worsen, events were unfolding far from the hospital. According to investigators and later court records, weeks earlier, a computer linked to James Craig had reportedly been used to search for information about poisonous substances. Investigators also recovered online searches involving fatal poisons and questions about whether certain deaths could appear natural. Records later showed that several chemical products had been ordered. Among them, arsenic, potassium cyanide, and a concentrated form of tetrahydrozoline. At the time, those deliveries did not immediately trigger a police investigation. But someone at the dental practice noticed that one shipment seemed unusual. That person was James Craig's business partner, Ryan Redfern. According to investigators, Redfern learned that potassium cyanide had been delivered to the practice. James reportedly explained that it was intended for professional purposes, but the explanation raised concerns. The practice did not ordinarily use potassium cyanide. Then Redfern learned that Angela had been hospitalized. Two separate facts suddenly appeared connected: a patient with an unexplained medical crisis, and the unexpected delivery of a highly dangerous chemical to her husband's workplace. Concerned by what he had learned, Redfern contacted a nurse involved in Angela's care and shared his concerns. That conversation prompted doctors and investigators to look at the case from an entirely different perspective. Until that moment, the hospital had been treating a critically ill patient. Now, the medical team had to consider another possibility: that Angela's condition might not have been caused by a natural illness. Medical personnel notified law enforcement. Additional medical and laboratory testing was requested. Investigators began examining the family's recent history, but there was still a fundamental problem. Suspicion is not evidence. A suspicious delivery does not prove who used it. An internet search does not prove what happened afterward. And a husband's presence beside his critically ill wife does not by itself establish guilt. To build a criminal case, investigators needed a reliable timeline. When were the substances ordered? Where were they delivered? Who had access to them? When did Angela's symptoms begin? And what happened during the periods when her condition briefly improved, only to worsen again? Only by answering those questions could investigators determine whether they were looking at a tragic medical mystery or a deliberate crime. The answers slowly began forming an unsettling pattern. According to investigators, the first online order involving arsenic was placed before Angela's initial hospitalization. A later order involved potassium cyanide. Records showed that it was delivered to the dental practice, rather than the family home. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors argued that the evidence pointed to more than one alleged poisoning attempt over a period of days. The theory was no longer that Angela had experienced a single unexplained medical event. Instead, investigators began examining whether several separate incidents might be connected. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, Angela's temporary recoveries, followed by repeated medical crises, were consistent with that theory. Whether the evidence supported that conclusion would ultimately become a question for the jury. By this stage, the investigation was no longer focused on an unexplained illness, but on whether the illness had been deliberately caused. And then, investigators uncovered another timeline. While Angela was moving between home and the hospital, James was communicating with another woman. She was an orthodontist from Texas. According to prosecutors, the relationship had become romantic. Messages were exchanged, travel arrangements were discussed, and, according to the prosecution's evidence, the woman traveled to Colorado while Angela was critically ill. To investigators, the relationship suggested a possible motive, but motive is not proof. People are unfaithful. People end marriages. People plan different futures. Most never commit violent crimes. A possible motive can explain why someone might act. It cannot by itself establish whether a crime was committed or who committed it. That is why investigators continued searching for evidence that could connect motive to actions. My analysis begins with an important principle of criminal investigation. This is where true crime storytelling often becomes misleading. A dramatic motive is presented, and people are encouraged to treat it as proof. Real investigations work in the opposite direction. Investigators do not ask only, why might this person have wanted the victim gone? They also ask, what physical evidence, what digital evidence, what witness testimony connects that person to the crime? Motive gives a case context. Opportunity gives it structure. Evidence gives it weight. Remove any one of those elements, and a story may still sound convincing while remaining legally weak. In the Craig investigation, the alleged affair was not by itself the strongest part of the prosecution's case. It was the way prosecutors argued that the medical timeline, the digital evidence, and the physical evidence fit together. That combination is what investigators ultimately placed before the jury. Angela's condition continued to decline. Despite intensive medical treatment, her health deteriorated rapidly. Doctors increasingly suspected that a toxic substance might be involved, but confirming exactly what had happened would take time. On March 18, 2023, Angela Craig was pronounced dead. She was 43 years old. Even before every medical question had been answered, investigators had already turned their attention to James Craig. They examined his electronic devices, his purchases, his communications, and his movements. Then another disturbing question emerged. Had Angela's exposure ended before she entered the hospital? Or, according to the investigators' developing theory, could it have continued even after she was admitted? Hospital surveillance footage soon became an important part of the investigation. According to prosecutors, the earlier alleged poisoning attempts had not been fatal. They argued that while Angela was hospitalized, James Craig entered her room carrying a syringe and allegedly administered another substance. The surveillance footage did not show what was inside the syringe, nor did it directly capture any toxic substance entering Angela's body. But investigators believed the timing was significant. So were the medical findings. According to the toxicology evidence presented at trial, Angela's body contained cyanide and tetrahydrozoline. By that stage, the investigation was no longer focused on whether Angela had been poisoned. Instead, investigators were asking who had access to her during her final days, and whether that person could be connected to the substances identified by the investigation. Those questions would ultimately become central to the prosecution's case. On March 19, 2023, police arrested James Craig. To the public, the investigation appeared to move with remarkable speed. A wife became critically ill. A concerned colleague raised the alarm. Digital evidence was uncovered, and her husband was arrested. But in reality, the investigation was only entering its next phase. According to prosecutors, Detectives soon uncovered evidence of alleged efforts to influence what happened after Angela's death. There were claims that Angela had been suicidal, explanations for the chemical purchases, messages allegedly written from jail, and additional allegations that James attempted to persuade others to fabricate evidence, influence witnesses, and even target the lead investigator. Those allegations became the subject of separate criminal charges and further expanded the scope of the case. The investigation was no longer focused solely on how Angela died, but also on what investigators believed happened after her death. The first challenge for detectives was separating explanation from manipulation. After an arrest, investigators expect a suspect to deny responsibility. What they examine even more carefully is whether anyone attempts to influence the evidence itself. According to prosecutors, that is exactly what they believed had begun to happen. While James Craig was being held in jail, investigators obtained communications that, according to the prosecution, suggested an effort to influence how Angela's death would be interpreted. Those communications included claims that Angela had struggled with depression, suggestions that she had searched for ways to end her own life, and statements that prosecutors argued were intended to support a suicide narrative rather than a homicide investigation. That distinction mattered enormously. If investigators could demonstrate that those claims were knowingly false, the alleged attempts to influence the investigation could themselves become relevant evidence for the jury to consider. In criminal investigations, actions taken after a crime can sometimes be just as significant as the events that came before it. Not because they prove guilt on their own, but because they may help investigators understand what someone believed needed to be hidden. Investigators did not immediately accept the suicide narrative. They tested it because every reasonable alternative must be examined before it can be rejected. They interviewed family members, friends, medical personnel. They reviewed Angela's communications, her daily activities, and her plans for the future. According to investigators and prosecutors, they found no evidence supporting the claim that Angela intended to end her own life. Instead, they found a woman making plans with her children, planning for the future, continuing with everyday life. That did not, by itself, prove homicide, but it weakened one of the alternative explanations under consideration. In any criminal investigation, eliminating unsupported explanations is just as important as establishing the correct one. Investigators then turned to James Craig's digital communications, his phones, emails, text messages, and internet search history. Modern homicide investigations rarely depend on a single dramatic discovery. Instead, they are built from hundreds of individual pieces of evidence. One message helps explain another. One purchase supports another. One timeline helps verify another. According to prosecutors, that is exactly what happened in this case. They argued that the digital evidence repeatedly aligned with the medical timeline. Viewed separately, each piece of evidence had limitations. Viewed together, prosecutors argued they formed a single, coherent narrative. My analysis begins with one of the most common misconceptions about criminal investigations. Many people believe detectives solve cases by finding one decisive clue. Reality is usually far less dramatic. The strongest cases are built through convergence. Imagine several independent lines of evidence: medical findings, financial records, digital activity, witness testimony, surveillance footage. Each one, on its own, may leave room for doubt. But when independent sources of evidence begin telling the same story, the likelihood that they all point in the same direction by coincidence becomes increasingly small. That is why experienced investigators rarely ask, which single piece of evidence is the strongest? Instead, they ask, which independent pieces of evidence support one another? Because in criminal investigations, confidence rarely comes from one dramatic discovery. It comes from many independent facts reaching the same conclusion. The investigation, however, was about to take an unexpected turn. After an arrest, many suspects become quieter. They wait. They speak through their attorneys. According to prosecutors, James Craig allegedly did the opposite. Investigators say he continued communicating with people outside the jail. Those communications would later become the basis for an entirely new series of criminal allegations. Not about how Angela died, but about what prosecutors alleged happened afterward. The allegations included attempts to influence witnesses, fabricate evidence, and interfere with the course of the investigation. Those allegations became the subject of separate criminal charges, to be evaluated alongside the homicide case. If the prosecution was correct, the investigation was no longer focused solely on Angela's death, but also on whether someone had attempted to manipulate the justice system itself. Investigators soon discovered that James Craig's arrest had not ended the flow of communication. According to prosecutors, it had simply changed where those conversations were taking place, from inside the jail. Craig allegedly continued communicating with people outside. Some of those communications quickly drew investigators' attention, not because they discussed Angela's death directly, but because they appeared to focus on something else: the evidence. According to prosecutors, Craig suggested that Angela had been suicidal. He also allegedly encouraged others to obtain or provide information that could support that claim. If those allegations were true, the investigation had entered a new phase. It was no longer focused only on what happened before Angela's death. It was also examining what prosecutors alleged happened afterward. Investigators now faced another critical question. Was someone simply offering an explanation for the evidence, or attempting to influence how that evidence would be understood? That distinction matters. One can be part of a lawful legal defense. The other, if supported by the evidence, may itself become part of the investigation. My analysis begins with an important investigative principle. Many people assume that a cover-up begins only after investigators have already solved a crime. In reality, those two investigations often unfold at the same time. Detectives are not only trying to determine what happened, they are also watching for signs that someone may be attempting to influence witnesses, destroy evidence, or introduce false information into the investigation. If investigators find credible evidence that any of those actions occurred, those actions may themselves become the subject of separate criminal charges, or important evidence in the original case. That is why protecting the integrity of an investigation matters so much. Justice depends not only on discovering the truth, but also on protecting the process used to find it. Because when the search for truth is deliberately distorted, investigators are no longer solving just one crime. They may be uncovering another. According to prosecutors, the communications became increasingly specific. Investigators alleged that Craig was no longer speaking only in general terms. Instead, they say he began asking other people to obtain or provide information that could support the claim that Angela had taken her own life. Those requests mattered, not because every request was necessarily successful, but because prosecutors argued they appeared to reveal intent. Detectives wanted to know whether these were isolated conversations or part of a broader effort to influence the investigation. To answer that question, they traced relevant messages, phone calls, jail records, and the people who remained in contact with Craig after his arrest. One name appeared repeatedly: a fellow inmate. Unlike letters or recorded jail calls, conversations between inmates are often much harder to verify. For that reason, investigators approached every new statement with caution. According to court documents, the inmate eventually told investigators that Craig had discussed far more than his legal defense. He claimed those conversations included plans to interfere with witnesses, the investigation, and the criminal case itself. If those allegations were accurate, the investigation had entered yet another phase. Prosecutors were no longer examining only what had happened before Angela's death. They were also investigating whether additional crimes had been solicited or planned from inside the jail. According to court filings, the inmate described conversations that investigators could not simply ignore. He alleged that Craig had discussed finding someone willing to fabricate evidence or provide false information. According to prosecutors, the objective was straightforward. If investigators could be persuaded that Angela had taken her own life, the prosecution's case could be significantly weakened. But detectives did not accept those allegations simply because they came from a fellow inmate. They looked for independent corroboration. Did the inmate know details that had never been made public? Did his account match recorded communications? Did other evidence point in the same direction? Those questions mattered far more than the statement itself. Experienced investigators understand an important principle. An informant's statement is never treated as proof on its own. It is a lead that must be tested, verified, or disproved. And according to prosecutors, that process of verification would uncover even more troubling allegations. Investigators did not rely on the inmate's account alone. According to prosecutors, they compared his statements with other evidence already collected during the investigation. Phone records, jail communications, digital messages, and the sequence of events following Craig's arrest. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, prosecutors argued that the alleged conversations did not appear to stand alone. Instead, they appeared to fit within a broader pattern identified during the investigation, a pattern investigators believed extended back to the period when Angela first became ill. Not simply an effort to deny responsibility, but, according to prosecutors, an effort to influence the evidence and the investigation itself. That distinction mattered. Once investigators have credible reason to believe someone may be attempting to interfere with an active criminal investigation, their responsibilities expand. They are no longer examining only the original allegation. They must also determine whether additional crimes may have been committed. According to prosecutors, that is exactly where this investigation was headed. The investigation ultimately reached its final stage: the courtroom. Over the course of the trial, jurors heard medical evidence, toxicology findings, digital records, surveillance footage, purchase records, witness testimony, and the communications that had become a central part of the investigation. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of that evidence, arguing that the state's conclusions should not be accepted without question. Ultimately, the decision belonged to the jury. On July 30th, 2025, after considering the evidence presented at trial, the jury found James Craig guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Angela Craig. The jury also found him guilty on multiple additional charges arising from his conduct after Angela's death, including solicitation offenses involving attempts to fabricate evidence, procure false testimony, and solicit the killing of the lead detective assigned to the case. He was acquitted on one lesser charge related to causing or aiding a suicide. Under Colorado law, the first-degree murder conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The court also imposed consecutive prison terms totaling an additional 33 years for the solicitation convictions. After years of investigation, the criminal case had reached its legal conclusion. But the questions it raised about trust, deception, and the abuse of professional responsibility would remain long after the verdict. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your support really helps the channel grow and allows me to create more documentaries like this. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss future videos. If you'd like to watch more mysteries, disappearances, and true stories, be sure to check out the other videos on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.